So, this time on Sitrep, it's a matter of days since we were told the Ajax armoured vehicle is safe with a squadron ready for action. Now, the Army's been told do not use Ajax because, once again, soldiers have fallen ill in the new armoured fighting vehicle. How could this have happened? And what does it mean for an already long-delayed key part of the Army's future warfighting plan? We'll get insights from someone who spent many years in the vehicles that Ajax is supposed to replace. We also have new information on possible delays to a key part of the Royal Navy's future capability. And what exactly can we do about the Russian spy ship which aimed a laser at an RAF plane?
We will not let the Yantar go unchallenged as it attempts to survey our infrastructure.
There are things one can do that make life horrible at sea.
Defence Explained.
Ajax is fundamental to the Army's future concept.
You can't introduce something into the battlefield if 10% of your crews are going to get ill. They haven't the time now to scrap it and start with something else.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Well, forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. When we talk about the Army's new Ajax armoured fighting vehicle, it usually has the word troubled in front. 7 years delayed, troops injured through noise and vibration, some of them medically discharged. So it was a big deal a couple of weeks ago when the Armed Forces Minister declared Ajax initial operating capability was reached and told BFBS Forces News.
The British Army is now able to field the best-in-class armoured fighting vehicle on the planet. We know it's safe to use, we know it's lethal against our adversaries, and that's why I feel confident as a minister to be able to say that it's ready to be deployed.
Remember, that was just a fortnight ago, but this week Luke Pollard told us
there are reports that around 30 of our soldiers have suffered noise and vibration injuries on exercise Titan Storm. We've taken swift, decisive action to pause all use of Ajax while we understand what the cause of that is.
One step forward, one step straight back again, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we're pausing until we find out what the cause of this is. And the thing that's worrying about Ajax, and we should say, look, it's not everybody is suffering in these vehicles, but a proportion of the soldiers who are in these vehicles are suffering some sort of effects of vibration and noise. And the thing that's worrying about it is that nobody can quite pin down the problem. The problem's been there for years. I mean, this goes back to 2010 when the vehicle was adopted. And I was reminded of all of the saga of the SA-80 rifle. I mean, when that was introduced in 1991, it didn't perform very well at all, the standard SA-80. And so in the late 90s, it was completely re-engineered by Heckler & Koch, who were then a part of BAE Systems. And then it's been a pretty good rifle ever since, and it's done a good job. And it'll be replaced by something else probably by 2030. But we knew what the problem was with the SA-80, or what the series of problems were. In the case of the Ajax vehicle, General Dynamics keep thinking that they've fixed it, but they haven't, at least not for some soldiers. And vibration, you'd say, the ordinary person would say, well, just fix the vibration. But actually, all machinery vibrates. And if you fix one vibration, it'll set up a vibration somewhere else. So there's something mysterious about the problems that Ajax gives certain soldiers. Yeah. And until we can pin that right down, and they've spent years trying to pin it down, whether it works or not, the fact is it will not command the confidence of the troops, and that's the whole point. They have to feel confident in the equipment that they're given.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring in BFBS Forces News reporter James Wharton, who's been looking into Ajax issues for some time. Hi, James. Good to see you again. Let's start with the incident in the last few days. What actually happened to the 31 soldiers who were affected?
Hi, Kate. So this is a major exercise on Salisbury Plain. That exercise is actually supposed to be going on right now. Today was supposed to be a press day for that exercise, and colleagues of ours were going to be in attendance. However, it all got cancelled. The exercise was paused at the weekend, and that's because, as you say, 31 soldiers were taken ill after spending time on the Ajax platform. The details we know are that the soldiers had spent between 10 and 15 hours on the platform, which suggests that this incident involves a number of Ajax vehicles. It's not just one or two. It also involved personnel across 2 units. So we know that the people injured in the incident were from the Household Cavalry Regiment and the Royal Lancers. Again, this points to it being an issue across a number of platforms. And the incident is so serious that a do not use decision was taken by Defence Minister Luke Pollard, who we just heard from, which remains in place right now while an investigation takes place.
And just a few days before this incident, you reported on the case of 3 soldiers facing medical discharge after working on Ajax, despite noise and vibration problems being declared fixed nearly 3 years ago. Just explain that story to us.
Sure. So that's 3 soldiers in my old unit, actually, the Household Cavalry Regiment. Sources told me that despite the assurances that were being given by people like Luke Pollard and officials at the MOD, particularly around Ajax gaining its initial operating capability status a fortnight ago, there were in fact personnel in the process of being medically discharged right now due to injuries they sustained on Ajax since the regiment, the Household Cavalry Regiment, began using Ajax. The Household Cavalry are a little ahead of the other units on their Ajax programme. They've had the platform for about 10 months longer than others. But like the incident on Salisbury Plain at the weekend, these injuries for the 3 individuals are vibration related. And what made matters worse, in this instance, last Thursday when we reported this, the MOD doubled down on their position that the vehicle is safe. This is a one-off. It's just one vehicle. And within days, they've been forced to eat their words on that.
Mike, James's reporting, plus reporting from Larissa Brown at the Times, suggests there shouldn't be a surprise, any of this. There's going to be at least one meeting without biscuits and coffee, isn't there? Any idea who's on the rack for this and who should be?
Well, it's got to be the project team and maybe the chief executives of General Dynamics, because they've been working at it and they've been reassuring the MOD that they got the problem sorted. And, as James said, the mystery is it's not one vehicle. It's not just one vehicle that there's something wrong with that particular platform. It's something in the whole design that affects some but not all of the troops. It doesn't affect most of them, but obviously if it's making troops disorientated and sick, then with the best will in the world they're not going to perform very well. So you can't carry on with confidence if this vehicle is bad for some of the soldiers who are put into it. And General Dynamics have really got to get to the bottom of this, but I don't think they can do it by throwing more money at it. There is something about the design which is really mysteriously wrong, and I don't see much future for the vehicle until that is sorted out. There will be a future for it because there's no alternative, but they have to sort it out and double layer hearing protection, which they do have. They have very sophisticated hearing protection. Obviously isn't the answer for some soldiers who get ill.
So, James, you've spent hundreds of hours travelling in this CVRT armoured fighting vehicle. What was that like? I imagine it wasn't without plenty of noise and vibration itself, but did you ever witness or experience anything like what you've described with those being affected by Ajax?
Well, by the time I learned to drive CVRT 20 years ago, it was already considered an ancient bit of kit. And believe me, CVRT had its faults. But if you speak to the right people, veterans or even those present for this crossover period from CVRT to Ajax, there is a slight bit of sadness that this old workhorse of the fleet has been retired because it stood the test of time. It was used for decades and it was deployed literally in every conflict the British Army was involved with over that time. It went to the Falklands, for example. It was there in the Gulf War. The same vehicles were there for the invasion of Iraq. And all the places in between. So I want to say that it had its charm, that vehicle, but blimey, it could let you down sometimes too. To compare the two vehicles, it's like comparing night and day. The step up in tech on Ajax compared to the analogue, almost World War II systems that CVRT had on its platform is, like I say, it's almost incomparable. I attended a veterans reunion recently in York, and there was a wry smile on the faces of some of the veterans who were listening to a current serving officer in the Blues and Royals who was talking through some of the incredible technology Ajax has, the acoustic technology and the sighting equipment, and people were both amazed but also baffled, and I think actually even a little entertained by how much of a step up in technology it is from the likes of Scimitar or Spartan to Ajax. I never come across anything like this in terms of people walking away from the platform with hearing problems or vibration-related injuries. But like I said, these vehicles, not just in terms of how they look in terms of tech, but the size and the weight difference, they're incredibly different.
So one thought that comes to my non-expert mind on this, James, presumably the speed of the vehicle makes a notable difference to noise and vibrations. Is it a realistic hypothesis that they're only really discovering what it's like when it's at top speed, in the Ajax, when it's at top speed, 70 miles per hour?
Well, it's one thing to be able to drive at 70 miles per hour. It's quite the other to actually be able to do it in reality. The way you operate an armoured vehicle is always terrain and situation dependent. Sometimes in a CVRT, a good driver would actually know when to deploy speed, and that vehicle, CVRT, could hit top speeds of around 40 miles per hour, nowhere near what Ajax can travel. But like I say, Ajax will very rarely be travelling at 70 miles an hour. The drivers, the crews will be asked to do road speed tests occasionally, and that will be an opportunity to do it. But, on the ground, there's no reason why you would be, asking a driver to put his foot down to those excessive speeds. When I was in CVRT, like I said, sometimes I used to see a bump coming, perhaps too late on the road, and I just put my foot down and hope for the best. But, the thing about a CVRT was that the commander was literally just stood behind you in the turret, and he could indicate with his foot, with a decent kick, whether or not you'd hit the bump in a satisfactory manner.
Mike, Ajax is fundamental to the Army's future plans. What is the fallback if there's another long delay, or even worse, they can't fix it?
Well, your mind goes to whether the Boxer vehicle can be adapted to some of these roles. The answer is maybe. There's the Swedish CV90, which is a possibility. I suppose if you had to look for other vehicles, or everyone would like the Bradley. That's the star of the Ukrainian battlefield, or was a couple of years ago. But really, there's no alternative but to making Ajax work, because it's a multi-purpose vehicle, 6 different variations which have to be performed for engineering, reconnaissance, and command and control, and so on. So they just have to make it work. I don't see that there's any particular replacement, because as James is saying, the vehicle itself, a bit like all armoured vehicles, same with ships, they're just biscuit tins really. It's what you put inside them that really matters, but in this case there's something wrong with the biscuit tin, but what is inside it is fundamentally important and seems to work, or we think it will work very, very well. But if the biscuit tin isn't right, then you've got a different sort of problem, and it's more basic in a way. It's the engineering problem of vibration and noise. You'd think that we ought to have been able to get over that, but for some reason we can't in this case. So it's a defective biscuit tin. That's my analysis.
But Mike, can we just carry on using our old fleet, or is it just too late for that?
Well, no. The Warrior is a much loved, James said, much loved vehicle, and the CV2s. But I don't think we can carry on with those. They are too old, and they don't contain the material inside which the Ajax has got. As I say, it's the insides of the Ajax which are really very, very impressive, as I understand it, and the adaptability of what the basic hull will do as long as the hull works properly.
So, James, an important question from your own experience. What is it going to take to give confidence to the men and women who'll be asked to get into Ajax when the do not use order is lifted?
Well, I think those speaking to the media, and I'm talking about officials at the MOD and ministers like Luke Pollard, who've recently consistently been claiming that this vehicle is safe, even in the face of mounting evidence to suggest that it isn't. They just need to reassess their strategy a little, because I just don't think it's doing their reputation any favours every time they make these statements. In terms of the vehicle, gosh, you worry that if they haven't fixed this issue after, 7 years? You worry that they ain't going to. And I think we're at a crunch moment on that, personally. Or I think that crunch moment is coming soon.
But James, just to go back to what you were saying, when you said that, you know, they're not doing themselves any credit by making those kind of statements. I mean, they're basing it on what they're being told, and they think it's true, don't they? They think it's safe. And as Mike was saying earlier, General Dynamics themselves think they've fixed it. So, I mean, you can't say we think it's all right to soldiers, and that's not going to encourage them, is it?
No, you're right. And actually, Luke Pollard yesterday, in a written statement to MPs, shifted the blame on MOD officials. He said that had been advising him, giving him written assurances that this vehicle was safe as he was making those statements to the press around the IOC date 2 weeks ago. So you're right, there's a little bit of pointing going on. But when Mr. Pollard gave those comments recently to a Forces News colleague of mine, when he looked my colleague square in the face and said, this vehicle is safe, we wouldn't be risking soldiers in it if it wasn't. There were a few eyebrows raised at that, you know, not least me, but I was speaking to my contacts in the Royal Armoured Corps who were operating on this vehicle. And, well, yeah, there's just a difference between the official line that's being put out and the actual lived experience of people who are dealing with these vehicles on a day-to-day basis.
James, I think there's a long way to go on this story. Thank you very much for joining us today and telling us about your experiences.
No problem.
Now, I repeated myself at the start of Sitrep, and in the past few days, the Defence Secretary repeated himself when he said to Russia, "We see you, we know what you're doing." This was as he revealed a laser had been shone from the Russian spy ship Yantar, hitting an RAF P-8 Poseidon surveillance plane, which was tracking the vessel off the coast of Scotland. The Defence Secretary said the Royal Navy's rules of engagement had been changed in response. He's not said how. That, of course, is not a surprise, but we can get some insights from Steve Prest and his 25 years experience in the Royal Navy now, and Rosie Leyden from BFBS Forces News, who's been tracking this one for us. Hello to both of you. Welcome back to Sitrep. Steve, what options would the Defence Secretary have for changing the rules of engagement?
Well, these things are always done very incrementally and very gradually, and the finessing of them is really important. So before you get into a set of rules of engagement, there's something that we have called a political policy indicator. And that's really, what is the overarching intent of the government in this situation? Is it to de-escalate the situation? Is it to keep it at the same level? Or there might be circumstances when you want to escalate a situation. So the intent of the government is indicated to the commanding officers and the operational commanders in using that sort of mechanism. And then the rules of engagement are framed around what the government is trying to achieve through the use of the military in any particular circumstance. Now, in this circumstance, I don't know, but my assumption would be that the government policy here would be to de-escalate. You know, we don't want to go hands to punching stations with the Russians in the North Atlantic. This is not good. But neither do we want to be bullied. So what they'll be doing is having a very finely balanced and nuanced conversation about how you go through this shadow boxing, standing up to this sort of bullying, aggressive confrontation, but without escalating the situation and without creating a bigger problem for yourself. I would see this a bit like what the Russians are doing is a bit like a playground bully who puts their hand in front of your face and says, you know, can't get mad, not touching, and looking for you to react. And the point of the rules of engagement is to try and frame how you stand up to that, but without overreacting and giving the bully an opportunity then to gaslight you to say, look, it's your fault all along, you're being aggressive.
So it's extremely nuanced. Russia denies the Yantar is even a military vessel. Shining a laser at a British military aircraft would suggest otherwise, though. Rosie, what is the threat? What's it up to?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. But, I mean, certainly all sorts. You mentioned shining the laser. We've also found out that Yantar appears to have been using GPS jamming. That was affecting HMS Somerset, which was tracking Yantar and other civilian vessels out there. But Yantar's main activities concern what's under the sea, undersea cables and other maritime pipelines. And the UK really depends on just over 60 cables for connecting ourselves to the digital world and so much else besides. So this is really important. As you say, the Russians deny Yantar's a military vessel. They describe it as an oceanographic research vessel. But in reality, we pretty much are all aware that this is a spy ship, and she's looking at that infrastructure, but not just looking at it because those positions are broadly known, but just tracking it. And although the Yantar hasn't been directly connected to the deliberate cutting of cables, unlike some members of the Shadow Fleet, some of these aging oil tankers we see. But there is a fear that she has malign intent towards them. And it's even been suggested that there may be the possibility that the ship is laying some kind of devices along key points in this cable infrastructure, which could be activated at a time of their choosing. And that would be a high-risk thing to do. So, is the ship doing this? We don't know. But certainly the Russians are very good in the maritime world. They have a lot of, and they're very inventive there. So there's lots of things the ship might be up to, and there's lots of reasons for the Royal Navy and the RAF and all other UK assets keeping close eyes on the Yantar.
Mike, am I right in thinking that maritime law says the Yantar has every right to be there and do whatever surveying it wants, and there's nothing we can do to block that?
Yes, if it's on the high seas, then it can engage in legitimate activity like any other ship on the high seas. But if it engages in activity which is a hostile act to us or to NATO, then in theory it makes itself a target. Just in the same way, if it launched a missile from the high seas of Britain, then we have every right to defend ourselves against it and regard that as a hostile vessel. And so if we knew, and we're prepared to say that we know this is interfering with our cables and we take that as a hostile act, then we could regard the Yantar as hostile, even though it's sitting outside our territorial waters. It depends on what it does. But undoubtedly, as we say, we know it's a military vessel. It's part of the Northern Fleet. The Russians have got another one called the Almaz, which is part of the Pacific Fleet, and reportedly they're building a third one. It's all part of their operations, so we know what it does. And as Steve said, it really depends on whether we want to interpret what it does as a hostile act and say so. And if we do, we're within our rights then to take forceful action against it if we think that it's actually threatening us in a way that matters.
And Steve, what are our options if we did catch it doing something? Rosie talked about the idea of the Yantar leaving potentially devices near cables for future activation to cause damage. Would we try to board at this point? And I'm quite puzzled as to why we don't know what it's doing.
Well, so there's a number of questions wrapped up in that, Kate. So let's start with the would we board the ship? That would effectively be an act of war. It's a Russian-flagged ship. The Russians would not give us permission to board. There are only certain reasons one has under international law for boarding a ship on the high seas. If you consider it that it might be engaged in piracy, that's a legitimate reason. If you think it might be engaged in slave trafficking, that would be a legitimate reason. I don't think either of those things are applicable in this case. Or if there is confusion over the flag of the vessel. And then you need the permission of so you can board it if it's not showing a flag and if it's not clear which nation it belongs to. And then you can do what's called a flag verification boarding. But I don't think there's any doubt that this is a Russian flagged vessel. And so in that case, under law, you would need the permission of the flag state in order to board the ship. If you boarded it in other circumstances, it would be a hostile act. In the same way as a Russian Navy or commando crew boarding a Royal Navy ship, we would consider as a pretty hostile act. So that's the sort of thing you might do in conflict, but probably not if you're trying to de-escalate a situation. Certainly not. Now, if it had left some stuff on the seabed, we could go and have a look at it. And, you might, I don't know what survey operations the Royal Navy is undertaking, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to discuss it on this channel if I did. But let's say, for the sake of argument, they went and surveyed the places the Yantar had been to see what they'd been up to. You could go and have a look, and there are mechanisms you can do to look at the seabed through high-resolution sonar imagery, and you can see that sort of thing looking at shipwrecks, but you can look for other things underwater. And we could go and have a look and decide whether we thought there were disturbances on the seabed or indeed things we thought were devices that had been left. And then, of course, if you do find a device that you think has been left, you have a choice about what you do with that. Like if you found a lobster pot or a mine, you could decide you were going to dispose of it. So if we found it, we would then have choices about what we did about it. Now, the Russians would say this is Russian state property and it's lying on the seabed and it's perfectly legitimate. So, you've got no business interfering with our stuff. And they might be right. Whether or not we might choose to interfere with their stuff, nonetheless, of course, is then a choice.
If we don't declare a laser aimed at an RAF plane as a hostile act, then what does it take for us to do something? And where do you think the red line is?
Yeah, I mean, the red line is wherever the government thinks it is at the time. Generally speaking, I think NATO has struggled with these issues in relation to cyber security questions now for well over a decade. When does this, hybrid warfare become a red line? When does it trigger, potentially NATO's Article 5 and so on? The general view, the consensus, but nobody's ever written this down, is when it causes real violence, physical violence. I mean, short of violence, short of something that is an explosive or kills people or causes extensive damage, it's not really regarded as a hostile act to the level of war. But that's just an intuitive sense, and I think most allies would probably feel that, and I think that's probably what the Russians work to as well.
Steve, you're nodding away there.
Yes, I am, and I agree with Mike. And actually, if you move away from this particular theatre and think about what's happening in the South China Sea, or indeed in the North Atlantic during the Cod Wars with Iceland, there were ships bumping into each other, and there are in the South China Sea, running each other off. They stop short of shooting at each other, but they do interfere with each other up to and including the point of playing bumper cars in order to try and force a change of behaviour in those sorts of environments. So it is this game of managing that escalation by trying to assert your will, but stopping short of something that's actually going to trigger a shooting conflict. And it's a real game of brinksmanship that we're seeing. We saw a lot of it in the Cold War, and Mike will be far more expert than me at describing some of the shenanigans that went on in the Cold War. But we saw that same sort of thing. But in the Cold War, everyone knew what the rules were. They might not have been written down, as Mike says, but everyone sort of knew where the limit was and where the boundary was. What makes our current situation, I think, quite dangerous is we're still working that out, and no one's really quite sure when that will be too much, especially in the context of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment.
Have you ever experienced it in your career, Steve?
We've had some occasional things where people got a bit close. People started behaving in a way that gave us a warning. I can tell this story when we were off Libya, for example. I was in HMS Westminster off the coast of Libya in 2011. And we were sat about 13 miles off the coast, so just outside of territorial waters. And we were watching on our radar the aircraft taking off from Sirte airfield and doing their bombing runs over Benghazi and then going back. And you could see that happening. And then one day, one of their aircraft turned out to sea and came pretty much straight for the ship. And it was, general alarm, air threat warning red. It all got very exciting for a bit. And warnings were red, and then the aircraft sort of just veered away and went back. And because of some other messaging we'd received through other channels, we knew effectively they were probing us. Because they knew we were there. The Libyan authorities weren't that happy we were there, but they were sending us a message really of keep your distance, don't interfere, look, we can send aircraft to get you if you're worried about it. And so that was an interesting moment. But it's all about testing the responses and sending messages and posing strategic problems to keep your potential adversary off-balanced, uncertain, ambiguous, and making sure you don't let them settle and be too comfortable. That's what's going on.
What about the Yantar then, Rosie? Can you put it into context? Because this is part of a bigger Russian programme known as GUGI, isn't it?
That's right. GUGI is the Russian main directorate of the Deep Sea Research Programme. And Al Khans came to Parliament to talk about this. And he said that Russia's been developing military capability to use against critical underwater infrastructure. We've talked about that. He's been developing it for decades. Gugi is developing capabilities which can be deployed from specialist surface vessels and submarines. So it's believed that Yantar has the capability to launch submersibles up to down to 18,000. And then that possibility of damaging or destroying infrastructure in deep water during a conflict. And if you listen carefully to what Al-Khan says, he says that this hostile intent is behind the change in approach. So he says that's why Defence directed a change in the Royal Navy's posture so that we can better track and respond to these threats. So that might be around how close ships like Somerset can get to Yantar, or what kind of tech or activities the Royal Navy can bring into play to track it.
And Admiral Lord West, former First Sea Lord, said this week we could and should be doing more. He said to make it very uncomfortable for a ship such as the Yantar, there are things one can do that make life horrible at sea. They are not all seen. Steve, any idea what those things are to make it horrible for the Yantar or any other Russian visitor, for example? Is it the sort of thing you were talking about, your experience in Libya, or is there more?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what Lord West has in mind, but there are things you can do to apply pressure. You know, how closely you navigate, how closely you shadow. I was talking about the sort of tactic of, putting your hand in front of somebody's face and not touching, can't get mad. Well, the sort of things in a maritime sense that would create that sort of effect, you just put your vessel in a place that makes it awkward for them to navigate. And if you wanted to get a bit more aggressive, you can start shining lasers at people. Now, that's a step. I think shining lasers at aircraft and pilots is irresponsible and reckless. And I think it's very dangerous. And I think we should probably not do that. But, or you could play very loud music to keep everyone away. Or you could decide that you were going to, on the high seas, and why shouldn't you do some live firing exercises close by? Now, you're not shooting at them, you're not putting a shot across their bows, but going up nearby and doing a live firing exercise nearby sends a message. If you do it at night, it's going to get everyone awake and make sure everyone's paying attention. So there's all these sort of games you can play, and you can use your imagination as to the sort of things you might want to do. And if you wanted to get really aggressive, you could start getting really aggressive and starting bumping into people. But again, those are quite big steps, and I'm not sure that's where we are. But I don't know what the rules of engagement we've been given are.
And Rosie, the tracking of Russian vessels in the English Channel seems to be almost routine news now. Are we just hearing about Russian ships more, or are they coming close to us more often?
Well, the MOD said on Sunday that these threats, these Russian hostile activities, are up 30% in the last 2 years. So I think there's a deliberate decision to call it out more and to make that part of our defence. The Yantar is by nature covert capability. So, to an extent, the Russians don't want to be looked at, don't want us to be talking about what they're doing. And, taking that ownership of what's going on is a form of power that the Ministry of Defence are using. So yes, we're hearing more about it, but it is up as well. So there is more activity in this area. And some people say that's a sign of weakness, that if conventional methods aren't going so well, I'm thinking of Ukraine clearly, then, you can lean into other stuff that makes people uncomfortable, that puts pressure on NATO, that perhaps unsettles the general public, whatever the aim might be. But yes, I think we can definitely say that more is going on, but equally it is being discussed more as well.
So, Mike, the Yantar, do we know where it is now, and has she been sent on her way?
I don't think it's been sent on its way. 2 days ago, the last time I looked, open source intelligence had it at about 40 odd miles off the Hebrides, and occasionally coming closer towards territorial water boundaries, but unless it's moved in the last 48 hours, it's somewhere off the Hebridean Islands at the moment. That's according to open source intelligence. I mean, MOD would know differently, of course.
OK, Steve, stay with us because we want to pick your brains on something else. But Rosie, we'll let you get back to work now. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, cast your minds back to the start of September when it was announced the UK would be selling Type 26 frigates to Norway in a deal worth £10 billion. Great for the British defence industry, but it raised questions about the schedule for delivering Type 26s to the Royal Navy. Mike, you might have some new insights on that. What are you hearing?
Well, hearing that the third of the Type 26s, which is due to be HMS Birmingham, we start with the Glasgow and the Cardiff as 1 and 2, and then Birmingham is number 3, but that one will go to Norway, and possibly numbers 5 and 6 in the build programme, it is rumoured, might also go to Norway. So that's a very good idea in other times to give our ally who's buying these ships, who wouldn't want an order for more Type 26s. But because of the difficulty of building quickly, then the Navy is not going to get, certainly it's number 3 of the build programme, and possibly even will have to do without the 5 and 6 for a few years, which will be very serious news if that is confirmed.
And yes, Steve, you spoke to us about this when the announcement was made, and you suggested that Ship 3 might have to go to the Norwegians to meet their deadline. And if what Mike is hearing is confirmed and ships 5 and 6 also go to Norway, sounds like a big problem for the Royal Navy and its fleet.
Well, it could be. And far be it from me to correct Professor Clarke, but I think HMS Belfast is the 3rd and Birmingham is the 4th, but we could check. Anyway, but look... Yes, so it could be a big problem, except that things are changing in the Navy and the Navy strategy. So First Sea Lord, in a couple of weeks' time, is going to give a speech at the Sea Power Conference, where he's going to set out his strategy for the hybrid Navy, I understand. And all of that, of course, is subject to the Defence Investment Plan and the machinations going on around there. But he gave a hint as to what's going to come in his keynote speech at DSEI, where he talked about moving away from destroyers and frigates as the unit of naval power in the way that we deploy them, and talked about delivering these sorts of capabilities, whether it's anti-submarine warfare, maritime strike, or indeed anti-air warfare and air dominance, through disaggregated effects. So this idea of a hybrid fleet, where you have vessels that will be combatant vessels, but will command uncrewed systems, both under the water, on the surface, and in the air, in order to deliver the effects in a distributed way. So you might have a command and control platform, or a few of them, to give you broad resilience. And then you might have the sensors, the radars, or whatever, or the sonars on one vessel. And you might have then the effectors, the torpedoes or anti-air missiles, or indeed strike missiles or whatever, on other vessels. And this disaggregation, joined up by some sort of digital targeting web, the instantiation of it in the maritime, becomes a new strategy for delivering the Navy. And in that model, then your frigates and destroyer force becomes less important, and you might have more flexibility then to share these assets with our neighbours.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Actually, I think, Steve, you must be right about the third one being the Belfast rather than the Birmingham, because the two sister ships will be the Glasgow and the Cardiff. So we're talking about the nations of the United Kingdom here. So I must be wrong about that, or what I was told was wrong.
It's rare, Mike.
It happened. Not wrong for long is our motto.
Very good.
But
go on, sorry.
No, I mean, Steve's point is a really good one, that we're trying to move into 6th generation warfare here, and 6th generation is the use of robotics. So it's not so much that the Navy would lack all of its Type 26s, but that it's the problem of shipbuilding. The fact that we cannot advance our shipbuilding quickly enough. So we've got BAE up in Glasgow, and we've got Babcock in Rosyth, and that's it for warship building. And we find it so difficult to increase the tempo of building ships, because we're still in a deeply peacetime rhythm of doing this sort of thing. It would be much better if we could just, as it were, lay down more ships and build them quickly with more workers, but we don't have the skills, we don't have the backup. It's a salutary problem, I think, that this reflects. But Steve is right. I mean, the Navy can work around this, but it would be better if it didn't have to.
And Mike, a defence source told us that negotiations are ongoing in terms of the scheduling for this. I guess the government's having to strike this balance then between the strategic need for exports and support defence industry and the operational need for the Royal Navy.
Yes, and it also, I mean, there's an economic reason as well, because if you allocate, say, ship number 3 to Norway, then you save a lot of money, up to £1 billion, because you're not having to fit it out. So you actually give yourself a break from that tempo of expenditure, but you've still got to take it on eventually. So I can see all sorts of arguments for this, and it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not what the government would want to be doing in a rearmament programme that we aim to ramp up very quickly. We're improvising all the time in trying to rearm ourselves quickly. And this is being repeated throughout the Western Alliance, I have to say.
And Steve, you served as Director of Navy Acquisition, so you know this process better than almost anyone. If the money is there from the UK and Norway, could BAE Systems theoretically produce these ships faster, or will it be at the limits of shipyard and workforce capability anyway?
I mean, it's a big if. But one of the challenges here, and one of the I think really one of the tacit admissions from the Navy, is that they can neither afford, even under the defence spending uplifts which are planned, nor crew, and that's even more important in some ways, because that's hard to generate, the future shipbuilding programme that we had planned, both for the frigates and then for a future air dominance system, what was called the Type 83 destroyer as a working title. So the plan was, as it stood, was undeliverable, both from a financial perspective and from a workforce sailors perspective. So there was an overriding necessity to do something different, notwithstanding the quite accurate observations that Mike made, and the points that you're making, Kate, which is about, well, if we just pump money into this, could they go faster? And the point is probably not now. If we'd have asked them to go faster at the start and said there's more money available, please plan to build these ships faster. And there was a time when it was being considered that these should be pumped out at a drumbeat of 1 a year. In the end, we contracted for about 1 every 18 months. And at least in part, that was to manage financial profiles. But those choices are made, the die is cast, and the whole setup is geared and the supply chain is geared around that tempo. Can you increase the tempo? Yes, and they're trying to. But it takes a bit of a run up, and these things really, the choices that need to be made up front. So, given all of that, the other plan wasn't going to work. It's really hard to accelerate the delivery of these big and complex vessels, which do give you an extraordinarily good level of capability, but only if they're there, and only if they're crewed, and only if you can get them to sea. Then what the First Sea Lord has done is looked at that problem and said, well, we need a different plan. And actually, we're going to start looking at how we can adopt technology, how we can adopt the advantages of uncrewed and autonomous systems. We've learned lessons on that from Ukraine and are looking to apply some of those lessons and some of that thinking to the sort of work the Royal Navy's doing, particularly in the blue water environment, which is quite different from what the Ukrainian Navy face in the northern Black Sea, but nonetheless, there are things we can do. It's an exciting opportunity. It's certainly going to be technologically challenging. Personally, I don't think it'll be as easy or as smooth as we hope. But is it achievable? Is it possible with the right will and the right application and the right technology and the right thinking? Yeah, I think there's something in it.
So we've talked this time about more troubles with Ajax, likely delays to the Type 26. They're all part of a big picture of maintaining and modernising the armed forces, for which billions of pounds have been added to the budget. And yet we hear a report from The Spectator's political editor claiming that Britain's top 4 military chiefs have met to agree to a letter to the Defence Secretary saying that the Strategic Defence Review is no longer deliverable unless they get more cash. Mike, a final thought. Nobody said it was going to be easy, but did we really think it was going to carry on being this hard?
I think we feared that it would. I mean, the Strategic Defence Review, which is, only earlier this year. I mean, I remember, being involved in reading the drafts, not drafting, but reading the drafts this time last year, late at night through November and December. And the review itself is the most radical review that we've had in 30 or 40 years. And everyone agrees that it's right. It sets out what our challenges are and it sets out what our response should be. And I think we all knew that the first 2 years of the review through to 2027 will be the hardest because you can't really change the spending profile. So we knew that. But what has been disappointing this year is the lack of a sense of real urgency, either from the government or I have to say in some respects from the MOD. It's as if the whole machinery accepts the argument but can't really gear itself up to the drama and the requirements that the SDR set out and which everyone agreed with. And that, I have to say, has been disappointing.
Just a couple of things. I completely agree with Mike. Of course, the uplift in defence spending doesn't really kick in until 2027. So we've got a budgetary problem to solve before then. And I think that's part of the challenge and getting that profiling and the glide path right. The SDR did some great work and was a really, really good document, but it didn't do any of the financial programming, so-called basket weaving of the equipment program. That's the work being done now. So that was always going to be necessary to work out how the sort of ways and means of delivering the strategy, articulating the SDR. And finally, just on the report in The Spectator, which I also read yesterday and I thought was quite amusing, projecting into Sir Humphrey's mind, you might consider that if the service chiefs wanted to write a letter, that would be a really difficult thing to do. But if a story was released saying they were going to write a letter and that this was the problem and this was what they were going to say, they can, of course, deny that's ever the case. And yet, the impact of the reporting has broadly the same effect as if they'd sent the letter in the first place, but it means they don't have to send it and can deny they were ever going to. And so it might be a convenient way of sending the message to Number 10 without having to go as far as writing a formal letter.
It's an interesting thought, Steve. I wonder, are you speaking from experience? On that note, I won't get you to answer. Good to have you on the programme today. Steve, Mike, thank you. Thanks to Rosie Leyden and thanks to James Wharton. I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Until then, as always, you will find all the latest defence news and analysis on our website, forcesnews.com. From me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.